she said that she has since found a therapist that is doing a different kind of practice in the last year, and that's what spurred her to kind of detransition and accept herself and come out of this. And she says, If I would have had this therapy at 12, I wouldn't have gone through any of this. This would have been so much more helpful if I would have had this kind of therapy at 12." And it just broke my heart.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for Friday, December 13th, 2024. We are here with Carol, Tim, Jose, and me, Arianne. First, a summary of today's news. Congresswoman Nancy Mace is attacked. PinkNews owners are accused of sexual misconduct. Transgender restrictions are poised to go into effect in Alberta, Canada. The San Jose State women's volleyball team is allowed to play in their conference final but is defeated. The UK, including Northern Ireland, bans puberty blockers for gender dysphoric minors indefinitely. The LPGA Tour bans a trans-identified male golfer. The Montana Supreme Court affirms a block on the state's pediatric transition ban. Washington State whistleblower comes forward to expose cross-sex housing in jails. And Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy, famous for facilitating the transition of minors, is being sued. And with that, we'll hand it over to you, Tim.
PinkNews, the world's most widely read, quote, LGBTQ plus publication, is facing allegations of misconduct and a toxic workplace culture involving its founder, Benjamin Cohen, and Chief Operating Officer Anthony James, his husband. A BBC investigation revealed accusations of sexual misconduct, including claims that James groped and kissed an intoxicated junior employee who was, quote, unable to consent. Witnesses described this incident as part of a broader toxic workplace culture with allegations of bullying, heavy drinking, and misogyny. Multiple employees also claimed that young female staff were asked to act as surrogates for Cohen and James. A request presented as a joke, but described by staff as, quote, creepy and sleazy. PinkNews began in 2005 as a publication focused on gay rights. In recent years, it has pivoted towards, quote, queer and transgender advocacy, coinciding with exponential growth in leadership. As of 2023, PinkNews reached 150 million unique monthly users, with 60% of its audience based in the US. Revenue climbed to 10.3 million last year, earning it the title of Britain's fastest growing media business. However, critics argue that this shift has left the gay population underserved. The Times reported backlash over PinkNews's, quote, one-sided stories targeting women, end quote, in debates over female sports and equality laws. Activists and former staff suggest that the publication's focus on click-driven narratives tied to transgender issues has alienated parts of its original audience. PinkNews has denied the allegations of workplace misconduct, but has not issued a formal statement. Moving back to the U.S., James McIntyre, a 33-year-old Illinois resident, has pleaded not guilty to charges of assaulting Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina on Capitol grounds earlier this week. According to police reports, McIntyre approached Mace, shook her hand aggressively with both hands, and declared, quote, trans youth deserve advocacy, end quote. Mace stated that the encounter left her feeling intimidated and reported pain in her wrist, her arm, and her shoulder. She shared her account on social media, tying the incident to ongoing threats related to her advocacy for women's rights, including her resolution to restrict Capitol restrooms to individuals based on biological sex. McIntyre is the co-founder of the Illinois chapter of Foster Care Alumni of America, a group advocating for foster care reform. While his actions and statements suggest alignment with transgender advocacy, McIntyre does not appear to have direct ties to major LGBTQ plus organizations. Witnesses at the scene disputed Mace's characterization of the encounter, describing McIntyre's actions as overzealous but non-threatening. McIntyre was released following his arraignment, and the case remains under investigation. Yeah, these stories highlight the challenges of accountability within this LGBTQ plus population. The allegations against PinkNews show how its shift from gay-specific advocacy to a broader queer agenda has diluted its focus and left its leadership unaccountable to the gay population it once represented. Meanwhile, the alleged assault on Representative Nancy Mace raises questions about actions conducted under this LGBTQ plus banner. For as long as gay rights remain grouped under an expansive and ill-defined umbrella, incidents like these risk being associated with the gay population, even when they have no direct connection to gay advocacy whatsoever. Just imagine if gay organizations, or formerly gay organizations like the HRC and allegedly gay publications like The Advocate, focused solely on gay rights, really focused on gay rights, holding our leaders accountable, investigating misconduct, policing ourselves, and advocating for the gay population's priorities. Without such a thing, gay men and women remain tethered to actions and identities that just don't really reflect our interests or work, and not only don't reflect our interests, but work specifically against us. Obviously, we're hoping to change all that. Stick with us.
Thank you, Tim. We'll now turn to Canada, to the province of Alberta, where 3 transgender-related bills are set to become law after they pass the final stage of debate in the legislature. One bill, called the Education Amendment Act, bans youth under the age of 16 from changing their name and pronouns at school without their parents' consent. It also requires parental notification if students aged 16 or older wish to do the same. Furthermore, the bill grants the authority to parents to decide whether or not to opt their children into sex education and lessons involving sexual orientation and gender identity. The second bill, called the Health Statutes Amendment Act, bans doctors from using puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones to treat gender dysphoria in patients under 16. It also bans any gender-related surgeries for patients under 18. And the final bill, the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act, bans trans-identifying male athletes from competing in female amateur sports, requires organizations and schools to report eligibility complaints, and expands the options for co-ed sports leagues to accommodate trans-identifying athletes. Eagle Canada, which is a 2S LGBTQI group, and the Alberta-based transgender lobbyist group Skipping Stone, have vowed to sue to block the legislation. These rules come at a time when there is an increasing number of towns in Alberta that have voted to ban pride flags and rainbow crosswalks on municipal property, including the town of Barrhead earlier this month and Westlock back in February. There appears to be a growing backlash against LGBTQ activist excesses in Alberta, which has a reputation for being one of the most conservative parts of Canada. Now, turning back here to the U.S. to offer an update on the San Jose State women's volleyball saga. On November 25th, a federal judge ruled that the San Jose State women's volleyball team could play in the Mountain West Conference tournament. The plaintiffs had argued that San Jose State's inclusion of a male player on their team was unfair to female athletes. But the judge, S. Cato Cruz, who is a Biden appointee, disagreed. Following the ruling, San Jose State went on to play in the Mountain West Conference Championship in Las Vegas on November 30th, but was defeated by Colorado State. This marks the tumultuous end to San Jose State's women's volleyball season, as multiple teams forfeited their matches against them in protest of their inclusion of a male player. On top of that, groups of sex realist women have attended San Jose State's matches, carrying signs and banners in support of protecting the integrity of women's sports, as reported from Amanda Kovatana's Substack and Extra Estrogenes X. Hopefully, the sanctity of female-only sports will be codified into policy, and we won't see a repeat of this drama going into another season. And now some news from across the Atlantic, where the UK has decided to indefinitely extend its temporary ban on puberty blockers for minors. That temporary ban was originally an emergency measure enacted in May. A press release from the UK government's website cited the CAS review as finding little evidence that puberty blockers help treat gender dysphoria. The press release also said up to 8 new regional centers will be open to better address the mental health concerns of gender dysphoric youth, in addition to 3 already created. Furthermore, it also announced that in accordance with the CAS review's recommendations, a clinical trial will start next year to better evaluate puberty blockers' safety and efficacy. On top of this, Northern Ireland has also decided to ban puberty blockers for minors. Northern Ireland, which has autonomy within the United Kingdom, had the authority to create its own policy separate from the rest of the nation. However, it decided to use its discretion to follow the lead of the rest of the country. Deputy First Minister Emma Little-Pengelly said on X, quote, "Today, we and the executive agreed to permanently ban puberty blockers for under 18s. This is the right approach, informed by medical and scientific evidence. The protection and safety of our young people must be paramount." End quote. The decision of the UK, including Northern Ireland, to ban puberty blockers for gender dysphoric minors is welcome. However, I can't help but still be concerned about the clinical trial. First, how are researchers going to identify candidates for this trial? Are they going to single out gender non-conforming kids, in which case won't gay kids be disproportionately represented in this demographic to be experimented upon? Furthermore, how are they going to evaluate the success of such a trial? Proponents of puberty blockers claim these drugs buy kids time so they can discover their true gender identity. But how are you supposed to correctly evaluate what a patient's gender identity actually is? And if we cannot know what a patient's gender identity is, how can we know if the puberty blocking drugs actually helped the patients correctly discover it? See, there is a problem here. If you block puberty with artificial means, you're in effect freezing kids in their adolescence, and they won't have developed proper sexual function or brain development associated with adulthood. It's hard to see how this developmental freeze is conducive to developing a stable sense of self. So I'm wary about the use of any puberty blockers to treat psychological conditions like gender dysphoria, even in a clinical setting. I hope this clinical trial loophole doesn't last long and is not easily exploited. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jose.
Thanks, Arianne. The LPGA, the Ladies Professional Golf Association, and the USGA, the United States Golf Association, have updated their gender eligibility policies set to take effect at the start of the 2025 season. The new rules bar trans-identifying males who have gone through male puberty from competing in elite women's golf events, including the LPGA Tour, the Epson Tour, and the Ladies European Tour. The decision follows consultations with experts in medicine, science, sports physiology, and gender policy law. Both organizations highlighted concerns over competitive fairness, noting that exposure to male puberty provides physical advantages that impact golf performance. Under the updated policies, players assigned male at birth, or as we say, just males, must prove they did not undergo male puberty beyond its early stages or after age 12, in addition to meeting specific testosterone level requirements. This policy affects athletes like Hailey Davidson, a 32-year-old trans-identified male golfer from Scotland, who has been a focal point in this debate. Davidson last competed as a male in 2015 and gained attention earlier this year after winning a Florida-based mini tour, the NXXT Women's Golf Tour. In doing so, Davidson displaced Colombia's Maria Borges, who would have taken the first place, as well as Lauren Miller from the US and Yu Zhang from China, who finished second and third respectively. Outgoing LPGA Commissioner Molly Marco Saman defended the policy, calling it science-based and reflective of the organization's commitment to fairness and inclusivity. She stated, and I quote, "The policy represents our continued commitment to ensuring that all feel welcome within our organization while preserving the fairness and competitive equity of our elite competitions," end quote. While the policies apply strictly to elite tournaments, the LPGA clarified that its recreational programs and non-elite events remain open to broader participation, reaffirming its commitment to inclusivity. The LPGA's 75th season begins in January, marking the start of a new chapter in professional women's golf. And with that, I'll hand it to you, Carol.
Thank you, Jose. So, news out of Washington State. A Washington State nurse has blown the whistle on men housed in women's jails. Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism has interviewed a nurse out of Washington State. In this interview, a former nurse going by the name Olivia, in the interview, worked for Jail Health, a division of King County Public Health in Seattle for 5 years. Olivia decided to resign and go public after feeling like her advocacy for the proper care and safety of the inmates was ignored and actively blocked by the current gender policies in place. I encourage everyone to go read the interview for yourself, but we will give you a few highlights here of the troubling situations and policies Olivia mentions. Inmates were free to declare a new identity and meet with health staff to initiate gender-affirming care at any point during incarceration. Neither actual transition nor intention to transition was required for inmates to be honored as transgender. A person could identify as male in the community but female in jail. Per policy, this was irrelevant. Approval for cross-sex housing was granted regardless of pre-existing diagnosis, physical presentation, or participation in gender-affirming care. This absence of a verification process created an unsafe situation for women and for trans women, according to Olivia, both of whom were at risk when nearly any male could qualify for female housing. Some health staff said that males were asking them, quote, "How do I get over to the women's section?" End quote. Some of these males had histories of sexually harassing female staff. And here's a quote I found interesting from the interview. Quote, this is from Olivia. "One female to male transgender person with an androgynous appearance was significantly harassed in male housing and requested unhappily to be moved back to female housing. This was an example of our suspicion that females identifying as transgender were not benefiting from the transgendered housing policies like males were." End quote. Thank you to Olivia for her bravery in blowing the whistle on these unethical policies currently being enforced in King County's public health system. And we will keep an eye on the story for y'all. Now going to Montana. The Montana Supreme Court on Wednesday affirmed a lower court ruling that temporarily blocked a state law prohibiting transition-related health care for minors. The suit was filed by 2 trans-identified teens and their families, and they are being represented by the American Civil Liberties Union and Lambda Legal. The case will now go to trial before Missoula County District Court Judge Jason Marks. Marks was the judge who initially blocked the law in September of 2023. And finally, The Economist has reported that world-famous trans youth medicine doctor Joanna Olson Kennedy is being sued by a former patient. Olson Kennedy is director of the Center for Trans Youth Health and Development at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, and has been for over a decade now. She has also headed up a recent trans youth study funded in large part by the United States government. This study, as we reported in a past news roundup, has remained unpublished by Olson Kennedy because she believes it would harm trans youth medicine. Clementine Breen, a 20-year-old woman currently in college in LA, filed a medical neglect lawsuit against Kennedy on December 5th in California. Breen was put on puberty blockers by Olson Kennedy at age 12. testosterone at 13, and given a mastectomy at 14. Breen stopped taking testosterone last year and began her detransition. The lawsuit's defendants are Dr. Olson Kennedy, the gender therapist to whom Dr. Olson Kennedy referred Breen to, the surgeon who performed the double mastectomy, and 20 as yet unnamed Doe individuals who were agents, servants, and employees of their co-defendants. One of the more damaging allegations against Kennedy is that she lied to Breen's parents when they expressed reservations over the medicalization of their daughter, telling them that Breen was suicidal when in fact she was not. Breen had initially sought help for depression. She tells The Economist, quote, she felt depressed and sought help from a guidance counselor. I mentioned that I might be trans, she recalled in the interview, but I also mentioned that I might be a lesbian and that I might be bisexual, like I wasn't really sure about my identity at all, end quote. We will, of course, link the full article, and we'll also keep a close eye on this lawsuit as it unfolds. So, what do you all think of this situation that's starting up here?
I'm curious to see, well, I'm curious to see how it goes, but it sort of speaks to this larger point about not really knowing legally who is responsible for this whole transgender health mess thing. Is it the medical providers themselves, like Kaiser? Is it the individual doctors that personally were involved in you? Are there people who are involved in the standards of care? There's so many different layers to this, of layers of responsibility. So I'm curious, purely from a legal standpoint, how this case will go forward. And if
Yeah, because there's a lot of defendants in here. I mean, over 20. This also goes back to what you were talking about earlier with your story about how do they know what someone's gender is? How do they know that this is working? There's just no actual factual medical basis for any of this. And so, even with, like you were talking about, the clinical trials, how is that even gonna work out? And here we see, this girl, I don't know, she wasn't even given any kind of actual psychiatric evaluation or help.
yeah, it's a fundamentally flawed medical paradigm to begin with, to be treating any psychological condition with physical interventions like this. And like I was saying, how are you supposed to actually evaluate, even in a proper clinical setting, whether something is working?
Yeah.
Suicide rates? Well, see, the funny thing about that is Cass said, well, there's really no evidence that these interventions reduce suicide rates. And then we hear Chase Strangio at the Supreme Court saying, well, the important thing isn't suicide rates, it's suicide ideation.
But tell me what teenager hasn't gone through a depressive phase where you could say they've had that? I mean, like, it's decently normal for teenagers to go through this kind of thing. And if you have other psychiatric problems on top of it, or trauma in your past, it's going to be even more likely. That still doesn't, I mean, it's still no place, that still doesn't mean that transition is going to fix anything, or that they're trans because of this. And also the whole suicide thing, if you tell somebody that if they don't have a treatment that they're going to kill themselves, the likelihood is they're going to believe that, especially when a doctor's telling them that or a therapist is telling them that.
Yeah, it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, I mean, we know even from media that media has certain regulations and rules about talking about suicide because, it can cause kind of a people to go through with it. It can cause kind of a social contagion type thing around it. And so we know that people are susceptible to a social contagion around this kind of thing. Yet they're using it as a basis of, fact to transition kids and folks.
Mm-hmm. On a somewhat positive note, this lawsuit was covered by the San Francisco Chronicle.
Oh, really?
Francisco Chronicle has been horrible, of mainstream US papers, it's had some of the most biased coverage of the whole transgender issue. But this particular article that profiled the plaintiff was relatively fair compared to some of the other stuff they've done.
Yeah, that's good to see. I mean, tide's definitely turning.
I don't know if it's the same detransitioner. I think I saw an interview on Fox with her, and I think she said something along the lines of, I wish someone would have told me there's no right way of being, female or something like that. So, yeah, that stuck to me about that interview. I think it's the same person. Yeah, pretty sure.
Yeah, in this, if I really encourage people to read the whole thing because there's a lot of information in there. But later on in the Economist piece, she says something like, if I would have had, she said that she has since found a therapist that is doing a different kind of practice in the last year, and that's what spurred her to kind of detransition and accept herself and come out of this. And she says, if I would have had this therapy at 12. I wouldn't have gone through any of this. This would have been so much more helpful if I would have had this kind of therapy at 12. And it just broke my heart.
Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining this week's news roundup, and we hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.